The human being lives surrounded by voices that shape their thoughts without them noticing. From the moment they open their eyes in the morning, the world begins to program them. The news broadcasts fear, social media defines what success is, culture teaches what it is right to desire, and what it is forbidden to feel. The mind, exposed to this constant bombardment, learns to obey without questioning. And over time, the individual believes that these voices are theirs. But they are not. They are codes installed in the collective consciousness, designed to keep humanity asleep. This is true brainwashing, the invisible conditioning that makes humans forget their divine origin. You, who are listening to these words now, are part of an ancient lineage. A lineage of beings who descended to Earth to experience forgetfulness and, through it, rediscover the power they always had. Except something happened. Many became lost in the labyrinth of beliefs, thinking themselves to be merely bodies with names and stories. But within each one still vibrates the same spark of the chosen ones, a memory that the world tried to erase, but never managed to destroy. Mental reprogramming is not a modern self-help trick. It is a rite of return. An ancestral method disguised under contemporary language. It is the art of cleansing the mind of interference and reconnecting with the original source of consciousness. What I call here brainwashing is not erasing who you are, but washing away the residue that prevents you from remembering. Because you do not need to become something new, you only need to dissolve what convinced you that you were small. Many will say that it is dangerous to tamper with the mind, that it is arrogance to defy the truths that the world imposes. But those who dare to do this awaken to something that others do not understand: the power to create realities, the power to transform thought into matter, emotion into movement, silence into manifestation. The secret is simple, but subversive. The world is the projection of what you believe yourself to be. Throughout this video, every word will be a key, and every reflection, a mirror. We will traverse together the mental field where beliefs are formed, break the codes of the conditioned mind, and reveal the secret method for consciousness to return to the throne. The same throne that one day you occupied before you forgot who you were. And perhaps, when the video ends, you will realize that you were never the prisoner, you were merely the creator dreaming of the bars you yourself drew. Within each human being, two worlds intertwine in silence: the world that shows itself and the world that dreams. One follows rules, repeats gestures, fulfills duties, and meets others' expectations. The other observes everything in silence, yearning for the freedom to be who it truly is. The opaque life and the dreamed life coexist, even though they rarely meet. The first moves through the conventions of everyday life. The second pulses like a spark of authenticity that insists on surviving beneath the layers of conditioning. Most people live without noticing the friction between these two existences. Life becomes a set of predictable repetitions, and the soul, in silence, awaits the moment to be heard again. It is at this point that discomfort arises, that feeling of emptiness that appears even when everything seems right. The being perceives that the body continues, but the essence has hidden itself, and when the soul is ignored for too long, it begins to manifest itself through boredom, anxiety, lack of meaning. These are forms that the unconscious finds to say, "You have forgotten who you are." The process of mental reprogramming is born precisely from this awakening. When the individual recognizes that they live imprisoned in a script they did not write, the path back to their own nature begins. They understand that much of what they call personality is merely the result of conditioning, inherited beliefs, learned fears, roles they put on to survive and be accepted. From an early age, they were trained to believe that love is conquered through obedience, that happiness depends on approval, that suffering is noble. And so, little by little, the dreamed life was fading under the weight of the opaque life. Reprogramming the mind is not denying the world, but reconciling with it from another center. It is allowing the soul, not fear, to take command. When thought becomes conscious, the being begins to shape their reality from the inside out. They perceive that the mind is a tool, not a prison, and that each belief is a seed cast into the invisible field of experience. Awakened consciousness does not try to erase the past, but learns to use it as fuel to create something new. At this point in the journey, perception expands. The individual begins to feel that there is a secret harmony between what they live and what they think. Everything around them transforms into a reflection of their internal state. Routine ceases to be banal, because the awakened gaze transforms the ordinary into the symbolic. The dreamed life begins to breathe again, and with it is reborn the sense of purpose. But this reconciliation does not happen without resistance. The mind, accustomed to controlling, fears the unknown. It wants to look back, confirm what it already understands, seek security in old ways of thinking. And it is at this point that the story of Orpheus emerges as a mirror of human consciousness, a myth that reveals, with beauty and pain, what happens when the mind, unable to trust the invisible, turns to the past and loses what it loves most. The myth of Orpheus carries within it a profound truth about the human mind and its eternal search for the soul. It is told that Orpheus, endowed with a divine gift for music, was capable of enchanting gods and mortals, moving trees and calming beasts. His lyre vibrated with such harmony that even silence bowed before its sound. But when Eurydice, his beloved, is taken to the realm of the dead, he sets out on a journey to rescue her. He descends into the depths, confronts the underworld, and with his music touches the heart of Hades, who, moved, grants him a condition. He may take Eurydice back to life, provided he does not look back until they are both under the light of the sun. The return journey is the path of the mind toward consciousness. Each step represents the human effort to bring the soul back to the surface. Orpheus, guided by hope and doubt, hears Eurydice's footsteps behind him, but does not see her. The fear of losing her makes him yield to the temptation to look, and the moment he does, she dissolves before his eyes. The myth does not speak only of love, but of the restless nature of the mind that does not know how to trust the invisible. This story is a mirror of the human psyche. Just as Orpheus, the individual descends into the depths of themselves in search of the lost essence. They face shadows, memories, and beliefs that imprison them, and at the moment they begin to free themselves, fear makes them look back, revisit old pains, justify old habits, relive the past that should only be observed and let go. And it is in this gaze that the soul escapes once again, because consciousness, when clinging to what has been, interrupts the flow of transformation. Orpheus represents the illuminated intellect, the power of the rational mind when inspired by love. Eurydice is the soul, the subtle, living, feminine, intuitive, and free part. The journey to the underworld is the process of introspection, when the human being plunges into the unconscious in search of what they lost. However, the mind, accustomed to control, cannot bear mystery. It needs to see, needs to prove, needs to guarantee. And when it does this, it destroys the miracle that was already happening. Every person who awakens spiritually lives this dilemma. Upon beginning the process of mental reprogramming, they are faced with the same invitation: move toward the light without clinging to the past. The look back is attachment, to pains, to guilt, to the labels that define who they believe themselves to be. It is the subtle act of trying to rebuild the new with the same old structures. The soul, however, does not dwell in yesterday, it flourishes only in the present. When Orpheus loses Eurydice for the second time, he is not punished, he is instructed. He learns that true love demands total surrender, absolute trust in the invisible. So it is also with the mind when it seeks its essence. Only when it releases control can the divine act. This is the hidden lesson in the myth. The soul does not return by force, but by surrender. And it is at this point that the path of consciousness turns back to the origin. Because before becoming lost in the noise of the world, the human being knew this state of purity, of presence, of spontaneous connection with the whole. This state had a simple name, forgotten over time: childhood. Before the world taught what it means to be someone, the human being already knew what it was to be whole. Childhood is that point of purity in which the spirit still breathes without filters, in which time is not divided between yesterday and tomorrow, and life happens in its most spontaneous form. In this phase, the being lives without the need for control, without fear of making mistakes, without the weight of judgment. They simply are. Each gesture is born from a creative impulse that flows naturally from the heart, and this flow is the original state of consciousness. As years pass, spontaneity is slowly replaced by conditioning. The gaze of parents, the expectations of teachers, the dogmas of religions, the comparisons of society, all of this gradually shapes behavior until the inner child falls silent. The living essence that once laughed at nothing begins to ask permission to exist. The mind, once free, begins to seek approval. And when this happens, the natural brilliance of the being is traded for a social role. The programming of the human mind begins early. It is not an act of malice, but of collective ignorance. Each generation teaches the next to adapt to fear. One learns that feeling anger is wrong, that desiring too much is sin, that being different is dangerous. The body grows, but consciousness remains imprisoned in an invisible mold that dictates what is right and what is acceptable. This mental prison is what many call normal life. And within this normality arises the cruelest myth of all, that suffering is noble. For centuries, humanity has glorified pain, believing that it was the price of spiritual evolution. What few realize is that this belief has become a code implanted in the collective mind, a manual of suffering transmitted from generation to generation. In it, happiness is suspicious, abundance is guilt, and joy is seen as distraction. But the truth is different. Pain is not a path, it is a warning, and joy, far from being sin, is the natural vibration of the soul when it recognizes itself alive. Breaking free from this belief is the beginning of true mental reprogramming. When the being begins to understand that pain is not virtue, but resistance to expansion, something awakens within them. They realize that the inner child, the one who was silenced, never disappeared. They are still there, waiting to be heard again, ready to teach how to live without fear. Reprogramming the mind is, in essence, learning to relearn. It is freeing oneself from imposed memories and reconnecting with that innocence which is not ignorance, but wisdom in its purest form. The mind that awakens begins to question everything that was accepted without reflection. Why is success believed to be sacrificed? Why does love need fear to be maintained? Why has spirituality been associated with the denial of pleasure? Each question breaks a link in the invisible chain that keeps the being in captivity. Reprogramming happens when consciousness remembers what it has always known, that the purpose of life is not to suffer to deserve, but to expand to understand. In this state of remembrance, childhood ceases to be a distant memory and becomes a portal of return. The being discovers that freedom is not in the future, but in removing everything that separates them from original purity. And it is precisely at this point in the journey that the first practical step of this liberation emerges, when the seeker understands that they no longer need to depend on the world to feel complete. Everything the human being seeks outside is, in fact, a reflection of what they have not yet discovered within themselves. From the moment they begin to perceive themselves as someone, they are taught to believe that the source of their happiness lies on the outside, in the gaze of approval, in financial security, in the love of another, in the image that the world projects of themselves. This dependency is the most silent prison of the mind, because the individual believes they are choosing, when, in fact, they are reacting. They live in function of stimuli, like an antenna that only vibrates when something external emits a signal. Mental reprogramming begins when the person understands that the world is not cause, but mirror. Everything that happens around them reveals what vibrates inside. Praise pleases because it touches the desire to be recognized. Criticism wounds because it activates the fear of not being enough. This dance between pleasure and pain is the mechanism that keeps consciousness imprisoned in matter. While the being seeks in the world what is lacking within themselves, they remain enslaved to illusions. Freeing oneself from dependence on the world does not mean denying external experiences, but recognizing that they are not the source of what one feels. Pleasure, love, and success do not arise from outside. They are internal states that express themselves through forms. When the individual understands this, power begins to return to where it always belonged, to their own consciousness. They stop chasing circumstances and begin generating vibrations. It is at this point that the seeker realizes that everything is mental, not in the abstract sense but literally. The mind is the field where reality is structured. The error of most lies in reversing the order, trying to change events without changing internal state. It is like trying to alter the reflection in the mirror without touching the face. This is why many live tired of fighting against the world, without realizing that the enemy is not outside, but in the beliefs that make them depend on something they cannot control. When the being awakens to this truth, a feeling of lightness arises. They realize that they do not need to prove anything, nor conquer anything, to be what they already are. At this stage, the mind begins to quiet itself. Comparisons lose their power, the need for recognition dissolves, and a subtle kind of peace begins to establish itself. The individual continues to act, but their action is not driven by lack, but by expression. They do not seek love, they radiate it. They do not seek wealth, they vibrate abundance. Everything that was once effort becomes a natural consequence of a state of inner fullness. But this understanding is not merely philosophical, it demands practice. Freeing oneself from dependence on the world is to confront each belief that still makes the being react to the external. It is to observe one's own emotions without escape, to recognize how much of life is still conducted by the need for control, validation, belonging. When this observation becomes constant, something inside shifts position. The mind ceases to be enslaved by circumstances and begins to operate as their conscious creator. And it is in this instant of rupture, when the being finally understands that power has always been within, that a new force awakens, an indomitable, intense energy that defies conformism and rekindles the inner fire. This force is the beginning of the sacred revolt, the fuel that transforms awakening into action. At some point in the journey, the silence of acceptance transforms into an inner cry. It is not a cry of anger, but of lucidity. It is when the being awakens to the absurdity of having lived so long in servitude to a system of beliefs they never questioned. This revolt is not destruction, it is movement. It is the instant when consciousness, suffocated by years of conformism, finally rises and says, "I no longer accept living on automatic." Sacred revolt is born when the spirit refuses passivity and begins to question what was once considered normal. Why was suffering transformed into virtue? Why is scarcity held as humility? Why was fear confused with faith? Each question opens cracks in the old structure of the mind, and through these cracks light begins to enter. The discomfort that arises is not a sign of error, it is the very process of rebirth. At this stage, the seeker ceases to be a victim of circumstances and becomes a co-author of their own story. The revolt is not against the world, but against one's own blindness. It awakens discernment and rekindles the fire of will, the same fire that, in myth, Prometheus stole from the gods to give to humans. This fire symbolizes the ability to think for oneself, to create, to illuminate one's own path amid the darkness of conventions. The reprogrammed mind does not fear internal confrontation. It understands that questioning is an act of love for truth. It is at this point that the seeker begins to realize that transformation does not happen by fleeing what hurts, but by the courage to face what is hidden. The fire of revolt is the energy that purifies, that dissolves masks, that melts the mental patterns that no longer serve expansion. It burns the old to make space for the new. However, this flame needs direction. When revolt is blind, it destroys. When it is conscious, it liberates. The secret lies in channeling this force not against the world, but in favor of awakening. The being who understands this transforms indignation into creative power. Instead of complaining about reality, they begin to shape it. Instead of resisting what oppresses them, they learn to transmute the weight into impulse. This internal revolt is the impulse that breaks the cycle of repetition. It is what pulls the being from the sleep of conformity and throws them into the unknown territory of conscious creation. It is the moment when the individual stops seeking masters and begins to listen to their own inner wisdom. Revolt, when understood, is not a gesture of disobedience. It is an act of fidelity to the soul. And when this force awakens, the universe responds. Coincidences align, doors open, new experiences arise. Not by magic, but by resonance. Internal energy begins to attract situations compatible with the new state of consciousness. External reality, once perceived as an obstacle, becomes a field of expression. But, so that this fire neither dies nor is lost in excess, the seeker must learn to adjust their vibration, to align the internal world with the external. And it is at this point that consciousness takes the next step, understanding that everything that happens outside is an exact reflection of what vibrates within. Everything the human being experiences outside is a projection of what vibrates within them. Reality is not a neutral stage where chance governs, but a sensitive mirror that reflects with exactness the internal state of the observer. Each encounter, each obstacle, each synchronicity is a vibrational response to the frequency that consciousness emits. When the individual understands this law, they abandon the illusion of control and begin to work in the only direction where power is real, the inner world itself. The common mind believes that changing life is altering circumstances, changing the job, the relationship, the city, the habit. But awakened consciousness perceives that circumstances are merely effect. The true point of creation lies in the state of being. A heart at peace attracts harmony. A mind in conflict creates chaos. The world is merely a mirror that returns to the being the content that they themselves sustain. At this stage, the seeker ceases to blame destiny or chance. They begin to observe the events of life as encoded messages that reveal where internal misalignments still exist. A hostile environment shows where there is resistance. A sudden loss shows where attachment still exists. A painful repetition reveals the pattern that insists on remaining unconscious. Reality, when viewed through this lens, ceases to be an enemy and becomes a teacher. Mental reprogramming reaches its maturity when the individual becomes capable of changing their internal state before attempting to change the external. They learn that vibration precedes result, and that feeling is the language with which the universe responds. When the mind is aligned with the heart, creation ceases to be effort and becomes flow. Everything that happens begins to carry meaning, even if reason does not yet understand. Ancient spiritual texts attempted to translate this dynamic through metaphors and parables. Among them is the biblical narrative of the Jews who, upon forgetting God, became enslaved in foreign lands. This story does not describe a historical fact, but a state of consciousness. Forgetting God means losing contact with the internal center, with the silent presence that dwells in each being. And being dominated represents the inevitable result. When the human disconnects from themselves, they become hostage to the world. The return to freedom begins with a simple gesture of remembrance. When the being turns their attention inward, when they observe their thoughts without identifying with them, they rediscover the thread that connects them to the divine. This remembrance awakens a different vibration, a lucid quietude that transforms everything it touches. External situations may continue to be challenging, but the way the being experiences them changes completely. They do not react, they respond. And each conscious response redraws the invisible web of reality. Aligning internal states with external events is understanding that the world is not something that happens to you, but something that happens through you. This perception dissolves the boundary between the spiritual and the everyday. Work, relationships, choices, all become extensions of consciousness. The being no longer seeks to control life, because they understand that they are life itself recognizing itself. When this clarity is established, the cycle closes. The soul, once lost, resumes command. The mind, once scattered, becomes servant to consciousness. Life, once opaque, shines again with the radiance of what is real. And, in this instant, the seeker realizes that the purpose of the entire journey was not to conquer anything, it was merely to remember themselves. Everything that has been said up to this point is not theory, it is an invitation. An invitation to look within and realize that the true battlefield was never out there. The world changes when you change. Reality bends when the mind realigns with what is true. This is the essence of reprogramming. To remember that you are the creative center, and that each thought is a seed cast into the soil of existence. You can continue living according to the programs you received, or you can choose to be the author of your own mind. The decision is simple, but powerful. Stop repeating what was imposed and start building what is authentic. Every time you silence external noise, every time you question a belief that no longer makes sense, the old program loses its strength. And when the mind is cleansed, the soul returns to command. Now ask yourself, how many of your choices are truly yours? How many ideas, emotions, and habits do you repeat without noticing? How much longer do you intend to postpone the life you came to live? The brainwashing of society was designed to keep you asleep. But true mental cleansing begins when you decide to wake up. If this content made you think, if at some point something vibrated within you, it is a sign that remembrance has begun. The remembrance of who you have always been, before the world told you who you should be. So, before you go, breathe deeply and take this with you. Everything is mental. The power that creates universes also lives in you. And what you choose to think today will be the world you live tomorrow. If you want to continue expanding this consciousness, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and remain with me on this journey. Because each new video is a new key, and each key opens a door back to your true self.